Yeah, Proton's not going to be close enough unless if they get a... They're getting a really good run. No way. This is going to be close. This is going to be so close. Oh my... Proton got it. You race 24 hours. You race 24 hours and it comes down to that. Despite the really high expectations for the Rolex 24, it did not disappoint. From the amazing finish that we saw in LMP2 to the constant battles going on in the GTD classes, it was an amazing way to start the 2023 season. And heading into this season opening race, all eyes were locked on the GTP class and the new LMDH cars that were going to be running in it. In the first race for the LMDH spec cars, it was the Meyer Shank Racing number 60 Acura ARX 06 of Tom Blomqvist, Helio Castroneves, Simon Pagenaud, and Colin Braun that claimed victory, putting on a dominant performance. They would lead 365 of the 783 laps in this race, and really throughout the whole thing, they just looked like the class of the field. However, as many 24-hour races are, it was not straightforward for them. After starting on pole and getting off to a strong start, it really didn't take long for the Cadillacs and the Porsches, who had been a little bit slower during the week, to step up and show that they could be suitable competition for the Acura. Despite this though, the Acura still did lead a fair amount at the beginning of the race and really seemed to be on cruise control up until about the 4.5 hour mark. After Tom Blomqvist, who seemingly looked unstoppable during this entire race when he was in the car, once he got out of the car and turned it over to his teammates, they started to lose a little bit of pace. Not only did they lose some pace though, but they started to make a few little sloppy mistakes. For instance, Simon Pagenaud in the International Horseshoe actually made contact with an LMP2 competitor, the Tower Motorsports entry. He just kind of came down on him in the middle of the corner, thinking that maybe he was clear. This ended up spinning around the Tower Motorsports Orica, causing the number 01 at Chip Ganassi Racing entry to have to slam on the brakes and take evasive action, and this ultimately led to an LMP3 at no fault of their own rear-ending the 01 and causing some damage. It was ultimately deemed a racing incident by the stewards, but it wasn't really an ideal sign, being only 4.5 hours into the race, to be making little mistakes like that. However, the number 60 would continue to show strong pace until around the 8-hour mark. The temps were dropping on track and drivers were really starting to struggle for tire grip, and this is when Cadillac started to really emerge as a legitimate competitor. As the temperatures continued to drop, more and more drivers were finding issues early on in stints. Since of course there's no tire warmers in Imsa, they were going out on ice cold tires and it was like they were driving on a skating rink. We saw so many cars going off in the International Horseshoes just as a result of having cold tires. In fact, just after a safety car restart, that Meyer Shank Racing Acura, while battling for the lead into turn 1, just lost it and spun around. There were some huge flat spots on these tires, and immediately after a pit stop under that safety car restart, they had to come back down pit road and change the tires once again. Despite this unplanned stop, they would manage to barely stay on the lead lap, but despite this, their pace didn't seem like it was quite what it was earlier. As the night continued to set in, the 01 Cadillac really emerged as the fastest car out on track, leading a majority of the late night laps and entering the morning hours with a very healthy lead. Through the late night hours and into the early morning, there was actually a very long stretch of green flag racing. Almost 6 hours to be exact. That long green flag stint all came to an end when the number 20 LMP2 entry lost it in the Le Mans chicane, and an ensuing full course yellow eliminated any lead that the 01 Cadillac had built up. After this safety car bunched the field back up, it was pretty much all Meyer Shank from there. That Acura was clearly the best car on restarts and especially early on in the run, and it really allowed them to just bolt out ahead of the field and get some nice clean air and build up a bit of a gap. They would cruise to victory, but it was the other Acura that had a bit more of an eventful run at the end of the race. The number 10 Wayne Taylor Racing Acura would really fight back hard in the final couple of hours with all the safety cars that came out, and they would actually gain a couple of laps back. This brought them into contention, and on the final restart of the race, with just about half an hour to go, they cruised past the number 1 Chip Ganassi Racing Cadillac to second place on the podium. After a strong race themselves, the 0-1 would round out the podium in GTP. Now, I mentioned it was an eventful race for Meyer Shank Racing. Well, after the race was completed in the post-race press conference, they revealed that they had been battling a gearbox problem since about the 6-hour mark of the race. The team was seen at various points in the race, removing the rear engine cover and topping up fluids, presumably to help combat this issue. And at one point in the race, team members were scrambling in the Meyer Shank Racing garage area in what appeared to be preparing an entire new rear end assembly for the car. All in all, Meyer Shank Racing said that they were just lucky to have completed the race. GTP was exciting to watch, but it was nowhere near as exciting as the finish in LMP2. An incredible photo finish would round out the race for them in what started off as what seemed to be kind of a regular LMP2 race. Ben Keating opened the race starting on pole for the class and really put in an incredible first couple of stints, building up a sizable lead. He, in that number 52 PR1 Matheson Motorsports entry, would go on to dominate the first half of the race, leading 251 of the first 390 laps. Stephen Thomas and the number 11 TDS Racing entry also looked strong themselves. However, when leading, Thomas would cut across the nose of a GT3 entry going into the Le Mans chicane. Fortunately, it just seemed like he wasn't clear at the time and actually go into the wall hard, ultimately leading to their race ending early. Various penalties and incidents would just plague the class as the race went along, as the number 18 Era Motorsports entry would ultimately retire from the race, and the number 52 car that was so dominant early on would fall out of contention. It wasn't until the final few hours of the race where this class really emerged as one to watch, which, with battles going on in this class for the entirety of the final stints. These battles would ultimately culminate in that last lap, last corner pass for the win. On the final lap, it really seemed like that the 04, that CrowdStrike Racing entry, they had it locked down. Proton, they sent it in around the outside. They couldn't really make it stick, and the CrowdStrike Racing entry got a really good exit off of turn 1, and it looked like they had enough of a gap to be able to maintain their lead for the remainder of that final lap. They'd be able to pretty well maintain that lead around the entire lap until the exit of the Le Mans chicane. Coming out of the chicane, the number 55 Proton Competition entry got a really good run, and as they moved through NASCAR's turn 3 and 4, you really started to realize that maybe they had enough momentum and a strong enough slipstream to take a crack at the win. Well, they did have a good enough slipstream, and that number 55 entry was able to beat the 04 to the line by just about a wheel length. Fred Portad, Francesco Pizzi, James Allen, and Gianmaria Bruni took the win ahead of the 04, with the number 88 AF Corsa entry completing the podium. LMP3 was a war of attrition, with only 5 of the 9 starters actually finishing the race. The number 17 AWA Duquesne of Anthony Mantella, Wayne Boyd, Nico Verone, and Thomas Merrill took the win, with the number 33 Sean Creech Motorsports entry coming in second place, 12 laps behind the class winners. And the Performance Tech Ligier would wrap up the podium 16 laps down. Really, the class was just plagued by reliability issues the entire race. If it wasn't a car catching on fire or losing a motor, then there was some damage that was caused by some contact from another class. And all of these issues really prevented any really good battles from developing, especially on the second half of the race. GTD Pro was perhaps the best class to watch from start to finish in this year's Rolex. There were great battles throughout the entire race from manufacturers like Aston Martin, Acura, Lexus, and Mercedes, that ultimately culminated in the number 79 WeatherTech Racing entry taking the win. Cooper McNeil, who announced that he would be making his final start in Imsa, wins the Rolex on his last attempt, along with teammates Danny Juncadella, Jules Gounon, and Mauro Engel. They took the win by just over 4 seconds from the number 3 Corvette. And rounding out the podium was the number 14 Vassar-Sullivan Lexus. The Mercedes and the Aston Martin, they really seem to be on another level throughout this race, clearly showing the best pace in their class. And really, like I said, there was some great battles that unfolded throughout the entirety of this race. Unfortunately, the heart of racing Aston Martin, which led 215 laps earlier in the race, would experience issues after an off track around the 16-hour mark, and that would ultimately drop them out of contention. However, for the Astons, it was a different story in the GTD class. Much like the GTD Pro class, it was dominated by the likes of Mercedes and Aston Martin, but this time it was the number 27 Heart of Racing Aston Martin, driven by Roman DeAngelis, Marco Sorensen, Ian James, and Darren Turner, that would walk away with the victory. They beat out the number 44 Aston Martin Magnus Racing entry by just over 5 seconds, with the number 70 Inception Racing McLaren rounding out the podium. Like in the Pro class, we saw some great battles here as well from the likes of Acura, Lexus, McLaren, Mercedes, and Aston Martin. They were all duking it out throughout the entire race. We saw a really strong performance from Acura, actually, with multiple cars up near the front, and both of those cars leading chunks of the race at various points. But really, the storyline that we're going to come out of this year's Rolex with in GTD is going to be the BOP discussion. I really hate that BOP is coming in and playing a role here, but unfortunately there were 4 manufacturers in particular that were really hurt by the BOP in this race. BMW, Ferrari, Porsche, and Lamborghini were all considerably slower than their class counterparts, and it was most noticeable in a straight line when the cars were on the banking. While some of the cars, such as the number 9 Pfaff Motorsports Porsche, were able to grind out a respectable finish in class, none of these cars had the pace anywhere close to being able to compete for victory. This is going to be a storyline that we're just going to have to keep an eye on over the next couple of months as we head towards Sebring, and I expect that there's going to be some pretty significant BOP changes heading into the round 2 of the season. Let's take it back to the GTP class for a minute, because really at the end of the day, they were the focus of this race for the majority of the 24 hours. Overall, it was clear that Acura had the best pace in this class, and it's probably realistic to think that we're going to see them taken down a small notch heading into Sebring. But some pros coming out of it are that I think Cadillac and Porsche, they looked pretty close in terms of on-track pace, as they were able to duke it out with one another at various points throughout this race. That was until the Porsches kind of dropped out of contention with not only some reliability issues, but really just some driver errors. And while those 3 manufacturers did all lead laps at various points in the race, BMW really just didn't seem to have the pace here. And although their pace got a bit better as the race went on, they weren't still exactly quick. Combined with multiple failures that they saw throughout the race, I think it's safe to say that there's still quite a bit of work that needs to be done to this car to get it ready to compete for class wins. Overall though, I think this race really went better than especially I would have expected it to. Reliability issues, which were a big talking point going into this, they were there, but they didn't really rear their head in the way that I think everybody thought they would. And ultimately, we walk away from this race remembering a pretty dominant performance from Acura, as well as some valiant efforts put forward by Cadillac and Porsche, and a BMW entry that we know we're going to see get better as the season goes on. The incredible fan interest in this year's race is also a big thing to take away from this race, with many who were present at the Rolex reporting that this is the biggest crowd that they've seen in recent memory for the race. In fact, there's probably new fans that are watching this video right now. If you're one of them, let me know what you thought of the race down in the comments below, and make sure to go check out this playlist with everything that you need to know about Imsa. A big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters. If you too want to support the show, then you can head over to patreon.com/offintheesses. A big thanks for tuning in. I hope everyone has a great race weekend and doesn't go off in the S's.